Can I kiss you? The billionaire asked, not knowing one kiss would change everything. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. Rain drizzled over the marble terrace of a luxury hotel in downtown Chicago. The city lights blurred in the wet glass, glowing like distant fireflies. She clutched her worn leather bag to her chest, the only shield against the cold night air. Her name was Claire Hayes, 25 years old, exhausted, and cornered by life. The bookstore her late father had built was weeks away from foreclosure, and her younger brother's tuition hung over her like a storm cloud. Tonight was supposed to be another fruitless night of searching for answers. Instead, it became the moment her world tilted. Across from her, under the golden glow of the terrace lamps, stood Alexander King. 32 years old, tall, immaculately dressed, eyes as sharp as glass. To most, he was the untouchable CEO of King Enterprises, a man who turned every deal into gold. To her, in that exact moment, he was simply a stranger, making an impossible offer. He slid a thick white envelope across the table. Inside, the black ink of a contract shimmered under the light. "Marry me," Alexander said flatly, his voice steady as thunder. "Think of it as business." Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. She thought she had misheard him. Marriage? Her eyes flickered down to the papers. Paragraphs of legal clauses, signatures waiting to be inked, and at the bottom line her name, already typed. "You cannot be serious," she whispered, her voice almost drowned out by the rain. Alexander leaned forward, his jaw set. 1 year. You play the role of my wife in public. In return, I pay your debts, secure your brother's education, and restore your father's bookstore. You walk away with freedom. I walk away with my shareholders off my back." Claire's chest tightened. Every word felt like a trap, yet every promise felt like salvation. She wanted to laugh, to push the envelope back and tell him he was insane. But then she remembered the eviction notice taped to her door, the empty refrigerator at home, the look in her brother's eyes when he pretended not to be hungry. "This is insane," she murmured, shaking her head. "Why me?" His gaze softened for the first time. "Because you are unattached, desperate enough to agree, and honest enough to keep it believable. You do not need to love me. You only need to play the part." The silence stretched. The rain tapped against the glass like a ticking clock. Claire's hands trembled as she pushed the envelope back toward him. "I cannot," she began. Alexander interrupted, sliding a small velvet box across the table. Inside glittered a diamond ring, cold and dazzling, a symbol not of romance but of control. "This is not a fairy tale, Claire. It is a contract. Wear it, and you save everything you care about." She stared at the ring, her pulse hammering in her ears. One wrong choice, and she would lose the last pieces of her family's legacy. One, yes, and she would chain herself to a man who spoke of marriage as if it were a merger. Claire whispered, barely audible, "What happens if I say no?" Alexander leaned back, his voice low, final. "Then you watch your world collapse, piece by piece. The choice is yours." The rain fell harder. Her reflection in the glass showed a young woman standing at the edge of a cliff, and for the first time, she realized that falling might be the only way to survive. The rain had not stopped when Claire finally left the terrace that night. The envelope felt heavy in her bag, as if the ink itself carried a burden too large to hold. She walked home through the dim streets of Chicago, her shoes soaked, her mind spinning. By the time she reached the small apartment above the empty bookstore, she was trembling. The apartment smelled faintly of old paper and dust. Her younger brother, Daniel, sat hunched over the dining table, textbooks spread in front of him. He looked up when she entered, hope flickering in his tired eyes. "Did you find anything?" he asked quietly. His voice carried the weight of a boy trying too hard to be a man. Claire forced a smile, shaking her head. "Not yet, but I might have found a way." She did not mention the contract. Not yet. How could she tell him that their salvation might come from signing her life away? That night she barely slept. The rain tapped against the window while the memory of Alexander's voice replayed in her head. Marry me. Think of it as business. By morning, she made her choice. The next evening, Claire returned to the hotel. Alexander was already there, seated in the corner of the lounge with a glass of whiskey in hand. He did not look up when she approached. He only slid the velvet box toward her once more. Her hand trembled as she opened it. The diamond caught the light, fierce and unyielding. She drew in a breath and whispered, "I will do it." For a moment, something unreadable flickered across his face. Then he nodded once, sharp and controlled. Good. The arrangements will begin immediately. 3 days later, Claire stood in front of a courthouse judge, wearing a simple cream dress that did not belong to her. The ceremony was brief, witnessed only by Alexander's lawyer and a notary. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, she felt her knees weaken. Alexander slid the ring onto her finger, his touch firm, his expression unreadable. "Welcome to your new life, Mrs. King," he said quietly. And for the first time her new name felt like a chain. The gates of his estate opened hours later. Claire's cab rolled up the long driveway lined with trimmed hedges and glowing lanterns. The mansion itself loomed like a museum, its stone facade cold and timeless. She stepped out, suitcase in hand, staring at the sprawling structure with a mixture of awe and dread. Alexander walked ahead without looking back. Inside, the foyer gleamed with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Everything spoke of wealth, but nothing of warmth. A housekeeper led Claire to a bedroom larger than her entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked gardens lit by soft lamps. A grand bed stood in the center, draped in silk sheets. It should have felt like luxury, but to Claire, it felt like a gilded cage. That evening, she joined Alexander at the dining table. He sat at one end, impeccably dressed, cutting into his steak with surgical precision. Servants moved silently around them. Claire lowered her eyes to the untouched plate in front of her, her stomach too tight to eat. "I trust you are settling in," Alexander said, his tone clipped. "This place is enormous," she admitted softly. "I feel like I will get lost." His lips curved slightly, though not in amusement. "You will adapt. Consider this training. Soon, you will be attending events where every eye is on you. If you stumble, they will not forgive you." Her chest tightened. "And if I fail?" Alexander set down his fork and knife, his gaze sharp as glass. "Then we both lose, and failure is not an option." The words hung between them like a verdict. Later that night, Claire sat by the window in her new room, staring at the gardens below. The diamond ring sparkled on her finger, a constant reminder of the bargain she had made. She whispered into the dark as if to her father's memory, "I hope I did the right thing." Down the hall, Alexander stood in his study, staring out at the same gardens. In his hand was the contract she had signed. He folded it once, placed it in the drawer, and whispered words no one else would hear. "This is business, nothing more." But even as he said it, he felt a small, unwanted doubt. The following week passed like a blur. Claire moved through Alexander's mansion as if she were a guest in a museum. Every corridor echoed with silence. Every wall carried portraits of ancestors staring down with cold eyes. Her days began with fittings, etiquette lessons, and endless instructions from a hired stylist who measured her posture and corrected every word she spoke. It felt less like preparing for a marriage and more like training for battle. The first test arrived sooner than she expected. On a Friday evening, Alexander informed her they would attend a company gala together. Claire's stomach twisted at the thought. She had never been to a gala in her life. The stylist draped her in a midnight blue gown, smoothed her hair into waves, and handed her a pair of heels that made her feel like she was walking on stilts. When the limousine pulled up to the dazzling glass tower that hosted the event, Claire's heart hammered. Flashbulbs from cameras exploded the moment Alexander stepped out, his hand extended toward her. She hesitated only a second before placing her trembling hand in his. The cameras turned on her, clicking furiously. She forced a smile, her knees weak. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers, golden drapes, and the hum of wealthy voices. Waiters carried trays of champagne. A string quartet played near the grand staircase. Claire felt out of place, clutching her small purse like a lifeline. Alexander leaned down just enough to murmur, "Remember the rules. Smile. Speak only when necessary. And never let them see you afraid." She nodded, her throat dry. For a while, she followed his lead, shaking hands with investors whose names blurred together. But then one man stepped forward, his eyes sharp with disdain. He was older, silver-haired, his suit immaculate. Claire recognized him as Richard Hale, one of Alexander's most powerful shareholders. "So this is the wife," Richard said with a sneer. "Tell me, Miss Hayes, pardon, Mrs. King, did you marry for love, or for the size of Alexander's bank account?" The words cut through the music and chatter. Conversations around them stilled, eyes turning toward her. Claire's face burned. She glanced at Alexander, but his expression was unreadable. He gave her no help. Her pulse raced. She could remain silent and let the man humiliate her, or she could speak. Slowly, she lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I am here because I believe in standing by someone, not because of a bank account. Wealth can buy many things, Mr. Hale, but it cannot buy sincerity, it cannot buy loyalty, and it certainly cannot buy respect." The silence held for a breath, then another. Richard's smirk faltered. A few guests exchanged surprised glances. Somewhere in the back, someone clapped softly before the music resumed. Alexander's eyes flickered toward her, something unreadable passing through them. For the first time, he seemed genuinely taken aback. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Claire kept her composure, speaking politely when addressed, smiling when the cameras turned their way. But inside, she was still trembling. Back in the limousine, the city lights streaming past the windows, she finally exhaled. Her hands shook in her lap. Alexander studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You did well tonight," he said quietly. She blinked, turning to him. "I thought you wanted me to stay silent. I wanted to see what you would do," he admitted. "And you surprised me." Claire did not know whether to take that as a compliment or a warning. She turned back to the window, her reflection wavering against the glass. That night, as she removed the gown and heels, she felt both exhausted and strangely empowered. For the first time since signing the contract, she had found her voice. But Alexander, standing in his study with a glass of whiskey, felt something far more dangerous, a shift he could not control. He told himself it was nothing, just part of the plan. Yet the image of Claire, lifting her chin in defiance, replayed in his mind long after the lights in the mansion had gone dark. The following days settled into a rhythm that Claire could barely recognize as her own life. Morning hours were spent with a poised etiquette instructor who drilled her on posture, pronunciation, and the art of speaking with grace. Afternoons were consumed with fittings, makeup sessions, and rehearsals for events she had never imagined attending. Each night ended with her sitting by the window of the vast bedroom, staring at the gardens, whispering to herself that this was only temporary. But something within her was shifting. The gala had left a mark. For the first time, she had stood up in a room full of power and had not been crushed. Alexander had seen it too, though he said little. His silence carried more weight than his words. One evening, after another long day of preparation, Claire found herself walking through the mansion's library. The shelves towered above her, filled with volumes bound in leather and dust. She ran her fingers across the spines, comforted by the smell of old paper. It reminded her of her father's bookstore, the one piece of home that still anchored her. She closed her eyes, letting the memory wash over her. "Do you read?" Alexander's voice startled her. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his suit jacket undone, his tie loosened. It was the first time she had seen him without the rigid armor of perfection. "Yes," she answered softly. "My father owned a bookstore. I grew up with these." He stepped into the room, glancing at the shelves. "Most of these books have never been opened. They are for display." Claire frowned. "Books are not decorations. They are pieces of someone's soul." Her words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. He moved closer, picking up a volume at random, then setting it back. "Perhaps you should choose one for me, something worth reading." The request surprised her. She handed him a worn copy of The Great Gatsby. Their fingers brushed, and the contact sent a shiver through her. He looked at her, studying her face, as if he were seeing her for the first time. Later that night, the two of them crossed paths again on the terrace. The city stretched out below, glittering against the dark sky. Claire leaned against the railing, her hair catching the light of the lanterns. Alexander stood beside her, holding a glass of wine. For a long while, neither spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "You are different from what I expected." She glanced at him, wary. "And what did you expect?" He held her gaze. "A woman willing to sign away her life for money. Someone I could control." Her breath caught. "And now?" He paused, his eyes softening. "Now, I am not so sure." The air between them shifted. Claire's pulse quickened as he stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers on the railing. He leaned in slightly, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Can I kiss you?" Her heart pounded. She should have pulled away, reminded herself of the contract, of the boundaries they had agreed upon. But the sincerity in his eyes, the weight of the moment, held her still. When his lips touched hers, it was not business. It was not obligation. It was something raw, fragile, and real. A kiss that should never have happened, yet changed everything. Claire pulled back, her breath uneven. This was not part of the contract. Alexander's jaw tightened, but his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "Some things cannot be written on paper." She turned away, gripping the railing, her mind a storm of confusion. This marriage was supposed to be a deal, a transaction, nothing more. Yet with one kiss, the walls she had built began to crumble. Inside the mansion, the silence stretched deeper than ever. Alexander returned to his study, staring at the contract tucked in his drawer. The words on the paper seemed meaningless now. For the first time, he felt the edges of a life, not ruled by terms and conditions, but by something he had long denied himself. And Claire, lying awake in the grand bed that felt more like a cage, touched her lips and whispered into the dark, "What have I done?" The morning after the kiss, Claire moved through the mansion with restless steps. Every polished surface seemed to reflect her face back at her, reminding her of the moment on the terrace. She told herself it had meant nothing, that it was a mistake, but the memory burned against her lips. At breakfast, Alexander sat at the head of the long dining table, his expression as controlled as ever. A silver tray of fruit and coffee separated them. Claire tried to focus on her plate, but the silence pressed down on her like a weight. Finally he spoke. "There is an event tonight, a board dinner. You will attend with me." Her fork paused midair. "After last night, do you really think we should?" His eyes lifted to hers, sharp and unreadable. "Last night does not change the terms of the contract. You will stand by my side and play your role." The words stung more than she expected. She forced herself to nod, but her chest ached. That evening, the two arrived at the exclusive rooftop restaurant where the board members gathered. The air was thick with the scent of expensive wine and the low hum of important conversations. Claire wore a sleek black gown, her hair pinned perfectly, but her hands trembled as she held Alexander's arm. Richard Hale was there again. His eyes narrowed as soon as they entered. He leaned close to another shareholder, whispering, then raised his voice just enough to be heard. "It is amusing, is it not? A billionaire reduced to parading around with a bookstore girl. How long do you think she will last?" The laughter that followed twisted in Claire's chest. She felt every eye on her, waiting for her to crumble. Her throat tightened, but before she could respond, Alexander spoke. "Careful, Richard," he said, his voice low but commanding. "You underestimate her at your own risk." The words silenced the table. Claire glanced at Alexander, startled. For the first time, he had defended her openly. His hand brushed hers under the table, not enough to be seen, but enough for her to feel the warmth. The dinner continued, filled with strategic conversations she barely understood. Yet she noticed how Alexander glanced at her when she spoke, how he seemed to study her reactions. He was a man used to controlling everything. But tonight, she saw something different. He was watching her, as if she were the only variable he could not predict. Later, in the limousine ride home, the city glittered outside the windows. Claire stared out, her reflection trembling in the glass. "Why did you defend me?" she asked softly. Alexander leaned back, his face half in shadow. "Because you deserved it." The words were simple, but they struck her like a chord. She turned to him, searching his eyes. "You are not supposed to care." That was the agreement. His jaw tightened, his gaze flickering. Agreements change. The car fell into silence, but the air between them pulsed with unspoken tension. Back at the mansion, Claire retreated to her room, but sleep did not come. She stood by the window, staring at the gardens where the kiss had happened. She whispered to herself, "This is not supposed to be real." Down the hall, Alexander sat in his study once again, the contract spread out before him. His hand hovered over it, as if the words might explain what he was feeling, but they did not. For the first time, the contract felt meaningless, a flimsy shield against something he could no longer deny. The next morning brought new pressure. News outlets had published photographs from the dinner, splashing her image across headlines. Some painted her as a gold digger, others as a mystery that the billionaire had chosen to hide. Claire read the articles in silence, her hands cold around the paper. When Alexander entered the room, she looked up, her voice breaking. "Is this what my life will be now? Every step judged, every word twisted?" He met her eyes with a rare honesty. "Yes, but you will not face it alone." Claire's heart ached at the contradiction in his words. He was both shield and prison, savior and captor. And though she told herself she had entered this marriage for survival, she could no longer deny that one kiss had cracked the walls around her heart. And Alexander, standing only a few feet away, knew that the moment he asked, "Can I kiss you?" he had set into motion a truth neither of them could escape. The headlines did not fade quickly. Within days, Claire's name was everywhere. Gossip columns speculated about her background. Old classmates sold stories to tabloids, and photographs of her at the gala were analyzed frame by frame. The pressure pressed down on her chest until breathing itself felt heavy. One afternoon, desperate for a moment of silence, Claire escaped to the gardens behind the mansion. She sat on a stone bench, her sketchbook in her lap. She had not drawn in months, but the pencil in her hand moved almost by instinct. Lines formed, shadows deepened, and soon Alexander's face stared back at her from the page. She startled, slamming the book shut just as footsteps approached. Alexander stood there, his suit jacket tossed casually over one shoulder. His eyes fell on the sketchbook. "What were you drawing?" "Nothing important," she said quickly, hiding the book against her side. For a moment, he looked as if he might press further, but instead he sat beside her. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the soft rustle of leaves. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "Do you regret it?" "Signing the contract?" Claire's throat tightened. She wanted to say yes, to declare that she regretted every second of this charade. But the truth sat heavy in her chest. "I regret that I did not have a choice," she whispered. He studied her face, something unreadable in his eyes. "Neither did I," he said at last. She turned to him, surprised. "What do you mean? You are Alexander King. You control everything." For the first time, he gave a small, humorless laugh. "Control is an illusion. My board demands stability. My investors demand an image. Without a wife, I was vulnerable. This was never about romance. It was survival." His words cut through her. But instead of anger, she felt a flicker of recognition. They were both trapped, bound by forces larger than themselves. The moment hung heavy until his hand brushed hers on the bench. The contact was slight, almost accidental, but it sent a spark through her veins. She pulled her hand back quickly, her pulse racing. That night, Claire found herself unable to sleep. She wandered the mansion's empty halls, the marble floors cold beneath her feet. She paused at the doorway of Alexander's study. The door was ajar, light spilling into the corridor. Inside, Alexander sat at his desk, staring at a document. But it was not a contract. This time it was her sketchbook. He had found it after all. Her breath caught as she saw him tracing the lines of his own portrait with his fingertips. His expression was not cold or calculating. It was vulnerable, almost human. "Why did you draw me?" he asked without looking up. Claire swallowed hard. "Because I wanted to remember you without the armor." His eyes lifted, locking on hers. The air between them thickened, weighted with truths neither of them had planned to share. "This is dangerous," he said softly. She nodded, her heart pounding. I know. For a long moment, they simply stood in silence, two people caught between duty and desire, contract and choice. And though neither spoke the words, both understood. The line between business and something deeper had already been crossed. The fragile balance shattered only days later. It began with whispers in the boardroom. Richard Hale had never accepted Claire, and now he came armed with proof. One morning, while Alexander prepared for a critical meeting, Claire was ambushed by a swarm of reporters outside the mansion gates. Microphones pressed close, cameras flashed, and voices shouted accusations. "Is it true you signed a contract to marry Alexander King? Are you only after his fortune? Did you trick him into this arrangement?" Claire froze, her heart pounding. Before she could respond, Alexander's security pulled her back inside. But the damage was done. Within hours, the story broke across every major network. Leaked documents, photographs of the contract, even her private sketches somehow made public. The marriage was labeled a sham, a staged performance to manipulate the board. Inside the mansion, Alexander slammed the papers onto his desk. His voice was sharp with fury. "Someone leaked this. Someone wanted to destroy us." Claire stood in the doorway, her hands trembling. "Us or me?" His eyes snapped to hers. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then he shook his head. "Richard, it has to be him. He has wanted control of this company for years." Tears burned at the edges of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "And what about me, Alexander? What am I in all of this? A shield? A pawn you can sacrifice when it suits you?" He stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "You are more than that." "Then prove it," she said, her voice breaking. That night, the board convened in a glass-walled conference room high above the city. Richard Hale presented the leaked documents with smug satisfaction. "This marriage is a fraud. It is nothing more than a contract designed to deceive investors. I demand that Alexander King step down." Claire sat at Alexander's side, her pulse hammering. The words sliced through her like knives. She wanted to run, to escape the humiliation, but Alexander's hand closed firmly over hers under the table. Then he rose to his feet. The room fell silent. "Yes," he said clearly. "There was a contract. But what began as business has become something neither of us planned. If you want to punish anyone, punish me. But do not think for a moment that Claire Hayes married me for money. She has given me more honesty, more strength than anyone in this room ever has." Gasps rippled through the room. Richard's smug smile faltered. Claire's throat tightened as she looked up at Alexander. In that moment, she saw not the ruthless billionaire, but a man willing to risk everything. Yet the doubt still lingered in her chest. Was this another performance? Or was it finally the truth? Outside the glass walls, the city glowed with 1,000 lights. Inside, the world Claire had stepped into threatened to collapse. And she realized that the next choice she made would decide not only her future, but Alexander's as well. The boardroom showdown left the company shaken. But it was only the beginning. Overnight, headlines screamed betrayal, fraud, and scandal. Paparazzi camped outside the mansion gates. Investors demanded answers. Claire could hardly step outside without hearing her name dragged through the mud. She sat on the edge of her bed one evening, the diamond ring heavy on her finger. She whispered into the silence. "Maybe Richard was right. Maybe I should just leave." Her door opened without warning. Alexander stood there, his tie undone, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Do not say that," he told her firmly. Claire rose to her feet, her voice trembling. "This marriage was supposed to be pretend. Look what it has done. Look what it has cost both of us." Alexander crossed the room, his eyes burning. "Yes, it began as a lie. But I am done hiding behind contracts and appearances. I will not lose you to his schemes." She stared at him, her breath catching. "And what if I walk away anyway?" He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the crumpled contract. Without hesitation, he tore it in half. The sound echoed through the quiet room. "Then you walk away free. But know this, Claire. What I feel for you now has nothing to do with paper. It has nothing to do with obligation." Her eyes widened as the shredded pages fell between them. For the first time since their marriage, she saw him stripped of power, stripped of pretense. The next day, Alexander made his choice public. At a shareholder gathering broadcast live, he laid the remnants of the contract on the table. This marriage is no longer an arrangement. It is my decision, my future, and if anyone here cannot accept that, they may walk away. The room erupted into chaos. But in the middle of it all, Claire stood beside him. Cameras flashed, questions flew, yet she felt something she had not felt in months, certainty. As they left the stage together, Alexander leaned down and whispered, "No more contracts. Only us." For the first time, she believed him. Weeks passed, and the storm began to calm. The scandal faded as new headlines replaced the old, and the board realized that Alexander had not fallen but grown stronger. Investors returned, reassured by his resolve. Yet the true victory was not in the numbers but in the quiet transformation between him and Claire. One Saturday morning, Claire unlocked the door to her father's bookstore. The lights flickered on, illuminating shelves once covered in dust, but now restored and alive again. The sign outside had been repainted, the windows polished. She ran her hand across the familiar counter, tears welling in her eyes. Alexander stepped in behind her, his suit jacket draped casually over his shoulder. "It is yours again," he said simply. "No board, no contracts, no conditions, just yours." Claire turned to him, her voice soft but steady. "Why would you do this for me?" He smiled faintly. "Because you reminded me that life is not just about balance sheets and board votes. It is about the people we choose to fight for." In the center of the bookstore, between shelves of worn novels and beloved classics, Alexander took her hands. For the first time, there were no witnesses, no cameras, no audience, only them. "Claire Hayes," he said, his voice low but sure. "I asked you once to marry me for business. Today, I ask you again, but for love. No contracts, no deals, only us. Will you say yes?" Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered, "Yes, 1,000 times yes." He slid a simple gold band onto her finger, far smaller than the diamond he had once forced on her, but infinitely more real. She leaned into him, and when their lips met, there was no hesitation, no bargain, no lie, only the truth they had both fought to find. The bookstore bell chimed softly as the door swung open with the breeze, carrying the sound of the city outside. Claire glanced around the space that had once symbolized her burden and now marked her freedom. "What a strange journey," she said with a smile. "A deal that turned into the best mistake of our lives." Alexander drew her close, his voice firm. "Not a mistake, the beginning." And in that quiet bookstore, surrounded by stories of 1,000 other lives, theirs finally began.